everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to Engineering for Change, or as we affectionately call it, E4C. Today, we're very pleased to bring you the latest in E4C's 2013 webinar series. Today's webinar was developed in collaboration with Worldwide Innovative Healthcare, or WiCare, and our guest presenter is Daniele Zurovcik. My name is Yana, and I will be moderating today's webinar. When I'm not doing this, I work with ASME, where I am a Senior Program Manager in the Engineering for Global Development Department. I'd like to take a moment now to tell you a bit about today's webinar, Development of Global Medical Devices, a Responsible Design Approach. Health is one of E4C's focus areas, and we're particularly concerned with capturing and sharing lessons learned in this area. So we're especially glad to learn about some best practices in this field today. To do so, we've invited today's presenter, Daniele Zurovcik, who's the founder and CEO of WiCare, to talk about some of the work that her organization has been doing. Daniele, we thank you for joining us today. Before we get going, I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the coordinators of the E4C Webinar Series generally. In addition to myself, we have Holly Schneider-Brown, Victoria Chung, Alex Torres of IEEE, who work on developing and delivering the webinar series. Thank you, team. If anyone out there has a question about the series, please be encouraged to contact them via the email address on the slide, webinars@engineeringforchange.org. Before we hand things over to our presenter for today, we thought it would be a good idea to remind you about Engineering for Change and who we are. E4C is a global community of over 13,000 technically minded individuals, such as engineers, technologists, representatives from NGOs, and social scientists working to solve critical humanitarian challenges, whether in water, energy, health, agriculture, sanitation, or other areas faced around the world today. We invite you to join E4C by becoming a member. E4C membership provides cost-free access to a growing inventory of field solutions and related information from all the members of our coalition, including international development agencies like USAID and Practical Action, professional societies like IEEE, AAC, SWE, and ASHRAE, and academic supporters such as MIT's B-Lab, and IIIT, as well as access to a passionate and engaged community to make people's lives better all over the world. Registration is easy and it's free. Check out our website, engineeringforchange.org, to learn more and sign up. The webinar you're participating in today is one installment of the Engineering for Change webinar series. This free, publicly available series of online seminars showcases the best practices and thinking of leaders in the field who bring leading-edge technology and solutions to bear on global humanitarian and development challenges. Information on upcoming installments in the series, as well as archived videos of past presentations, can be found on the E4C Webinars webpage, which you see listed here, engineeringforchange-webinars.org. If you're on Twitter, I'd also like to invite you to join the conversation with us using the hashtag E4C Webinars. E4C's next webinar will be on March 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard with Victor Angel, who is the Vice President of Product Development for Uncharted Play, which develops an innovative portable generator in the form of a soccer ball called the Socket. He will be sharing insights in a talk titled The Art of Being a Hardware Startup. To register, please visit the E4C Webinars page listed here. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Let's see where everyone is from today. I'll get started here. In the chat window, please type your location. Any technical questions or administrative problems you should have, go into the same chat window. Feel free to send a private chat to Holly or myself. You can also use the chat window to type in any remarks you may have. During the webinar, please use the Q&A window located below the chat window to type in your questions for the presenter. That way we'll keep track of the questions as they're coming in and make sure nothing gets lost. If you're listening to the audio broadcast and you encounter any trouble, try hitting stop and then start. If that does not work, you can use the caller number for the telecom. You may also want to try opening up WebEx in a different browser. Following the webinar, to request a certificate of completion showing 1 professional development hour per session, please provide your full name and date you completed this webinar, as well as the code that will be at the end of the presentation. Send this all to ead-ceuadmin@IEEE.org. See, we have a lot of folks from all over the world today, and we're very excited you all join us. Let's talk a little bit about who's presenting today. So today's presenter is Daniele Zurovcik, and she's the CEO of WiCare. WiCare develops innovative medical devices that are technically and affordable worldwide, from rural clinics in the developing world to state-of-the-art clinics in the U.S. It improves access to and reduces the cost of healthcare worldwide. It is a goal to prove that you can both help people on a global scale and grow and sustain a large for-profit company. Prior to WiCare, Daniele has over 10 years of technical research experience, patent-pending inventions in MRI-driven actuators and simplified negative pressure wound devices. With her sNPWT device invention, the wound pump, she traveled to after the January 2010 earthquake to participate in the surgical relief effort since the uptake of donated commercial NPWT devices was limited by the lack of electricity and training. Additionally, the engineer on a multidisciplinary field team during phase 1 clinical trials in Rwanda from 2011 to 2012 on the wound pump device. We're very excited to have Daniele join us today, and I'll turn over the presentation to her.
Hi, this is Daniele Zurovcik, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm excited to join you today, and thank you for attending. So I just wanted to get started with with the next slide, which is basically I wanted to take a look at what does it mean to design truly global medical devices. And if we look at these 4 images, they really span the gamut. So if you look there, it goes from basically military disaster relief through the developing world to a little bit more infrastructure in the emerging markets through the developed world setting in a typical room that you would see in a hospital. And so how do you design devices that could truly span all these realms and all the needs in these realms? And typically throughout history, devices have been designed in the developed world and donated or tried to be put into these other less structured environments and more austere environments. And I would refer you to the WHO study, the World Health Organization study, which has a plethora of information as far as issues with doing that. And they state in that information that over 70% of all donated medical equipment to Africa is deactivated within 3 months. And the reason why is we're not designing them with their needs in mind, but yet we're trying to implement them there. So I wanted to take a look today at what my process has been in designing the negative pressure wound therapy device, and perhaps providing you with some information and some tools to put into your toolbox in moving ahead with your efforts, or also to not only in medical devices, but in global devices and products in general. So let's look at the global responsible device realization process that I kind of just put together to give a visual image of what we're actually doing. And I really think it's our responsibility to include this global vision if we plan on putting those products into the global market and really making an impact worldwide. So the first step is the problem and needs identification step. where it's just identifying a problem to solve. In my case, Dr. Robert Sheridan came to a course 275 at MIT, and said that he wanted negative pressure wound therapy for wound clinics in Honduras. And I think as I was, you're more than willing to jump on a problem when you're looking for a problem to solve. But you really need to take a step back and understand, is this a Robert Sheridan once-a-year problem when he goes to Honduras, or is it truly a global problem? And I'm not saying that each one is not important, but today I want to focus on truly global impacts and worldwide impacts. And also the solution that he proposed, negative pressure wound therapy. Is there another solution that might be more applicable on a global scale, or is negative pressure wound therapy really the answer? So first of all, let's ask ourselves, what is negative pressure wound therapy? And I apologize if this is pretty much the only wound photo that you will see, so I apologize if this is squeamish a little bit for you. I'm used to it by now, but it was at first. And negative pressure wound therapy really is the application, and it's pretty simple, of vacuum pressure to a wound cavity. And so what you do is, it's 3 easy steps. You apply a porous material such as gauze or a sponge into the wound cavity, as you see in the photos. You seal it off from its environment with an occlusive drape. You connect the tube and pull a vacuum on that tube. And the vacuum pressures from 40 to 200 millimeters of mercury have been proven in the literature. So it's pretty broad, and you want to change these disposable components every 3 days. The therapy for healing lasts for 4 weeks to 16 weeks, so a month to 4 months. And it's really used for many applications. It's used in wound healing. It's been proven to heal wounds up to 2 times or over 2 times faster. It's used in wound bed preparation. So for graft sites in particular, it creates a nice, moist, healthy environment for graft survival. And also for patient transport, often used in the military settings, they'll transport a patient to another point of care and create this nice, safe environment for the wound. And so what are our alternative treatments? And negative pressure wound therapy is the only bedside therapy proven to heal many difficult wounds. And you're often competing in that area with large hyperbaric oxygen chambers that really aren't applicable on a global scale, especially in the field setting. And then, or you're looking at biologics or chemical-based therapies that really have an environment control issue when you get into austere environments. So negative pressure wound therapy is a pretty good solution. And in order to understand what we're designing, you really need to understand the principles of the therapy. So negative pressure wound therapy creates a moist wound healing environment. Now, remember when our parents said, and this is in my case, I am assuming it's in a lot of our cases, to let your wounds air, let the air reach your wounds. Well, it's been proven in the recent years that moist, closed wound healing environments actually promote healing. Negative pressure wound therapy reduces the fluid buildup, the edema in the wound cavity, which reduces the bacterial burden and reduces the infection risk. It increases blood flow to that area through suction, and in that case, for instance, diabetics can now heal their wounds by the increased blood flow and the increased nutrients coming to their wound cavities. It draws the wound edges together and increases the rate of granulation tissue formation. So you get less scarring and more of your native tissue. And it's critical to understand exactly what's happening. So when you design your device, you're not eliminating one of these benefits. And so negative pressure wound therapy has a huge need, specifically for chronic wounds. So chronic wounds will not heal on their own. They're typically venous pressure, diabetic ulcers that take months or years to heal if they do heal, and they result in many of amputations. 1 to 2%, it's really a global problem spread across the board, that 1 to 2% of us will have at least one chronic wound in our lifetime. That's about 44 million chronic wounds worldwide, 4 million in the U.S. alone. However, negative pressure wound therapy is treating less than 750,000 of these patients. So that data has come from the literature, has come from the internet, and it's great data in order to understand the huge global need which really can't solve. But, however,
Thank you for calling ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. ASME is a not-for-profit, charitable, and educational organization with a mission to advance, disseminate, and apply engineering knowledge for improving the quality of life. Founded in 1880 by a small group of leading industrialists, ASME has grown through the decades to include more than 120,000 members in over 100.
But this data is really spread out. And it's really easy for people to make a lot of assumptions with data in order to reach the global need. I see the message about the ASME phone message. I heard that too, so bear with us on our end. But hopefully, if there's any other problems, feel free to post. So anyway, so whenever you're identifying your needs in negative pressure wound therapy or any device, your global data is really spread out, and it's really, there's not a lot of data collection on austere environments. And so in order to verify what actual the need is in these austere environments, asking around and asking your final customers in every single market is really important to verify the need. So why are these devices not reaching these patients? And that's really a question we need to ask ourselves. And it's really the limitations of the device. These devices today, they're commercial devices, they're rented about $100 per day. You could buy them for $15,000 to $20,000. However, they're very expensive, and they have a high electrical requirement, upwards of 70 watts of power. They're large in size and not very portable, weighing about 10 pounds. And they have a steep learning curve with a complex computer interface that really, if there's a lack of training, it's not really applicable. So let's look at, now that we've solved the problem and identified the need and really verified the global need for this device and that this solution really is a great solution, let's look at the fundamental physics breakdown. Now, the fundamental physics breakdown is essential. I can't say this enough. It's an essential part of the design process. It's really your foundation of what you're building off of. So let's look at the power, let's break down and look at the power of the therapy. From a first order perspective, at this point you should not be doing complicated engineering work. You should really be identifying and understanding the problem and what solutions you could build from it. So our givens is the typical therapy is about 125 millimeters of mercury vacuum with a maximum fluid removal at 100 milliliters per day of fluid from the wound cavity. And that was found through interviewing doctors. And then we could assume that a pump efficiency of one of these devices operates at about 25%, and we could ignore viscous friction. Now, bear with me if you're not an engineer. I understand the equations might be a little bit daunting at first, but hopefully if we get through this, then it's not as complicated as it looks. But from a first order perspective, the power times the pump efficiency equals the flow rate times the differential in pressure. So if we plug in our data that we know, we see that the power of the therapy itself requires 77 microwatts of power. Now let's look at this. 77 microwatts is way less than the 70 watts of power that's advertised for the maximum operation of the device. So right now, just doing a first level fundamental perspective of the therapy, we understand there's a ton of room for improvement and really need to understand where that improvement might lie. So let's look at the current devices. The typical operating therapy, again, is 125 millimeters of mercury, and it's advertised that the maximum power consumption is about 70 watts. The typical operating power, we could assume, is about 50% of that. The electrical systems may be taking up about 21 watts of power and operating at a pump efficiency of 25%. Now, if we solve for the fluid flow rate this time, we see that at that operating power of the device, we're pulling in 13 liters per minute of fluid. So let's take a step back and really look at this from a fundamental perspective level. 13 liters per minute of fluid taken out of your body, you wouldn't be here for very long. So what is really causing that to be much larger than the 100 milliliters per day of fluid that we would expect. What is really going on here? So in order to do that, let's just look at what's actually happening. So fluid flow into the system, where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from the wound cavity. But where else might it be coming from? And by looking at the system, we would be soon to realize that there's this interface between the dressing and the skin where air could seep through the dressing and combine with the wound fluid coming into the pump. And that's really what's going on. The fluid flow rate includes the wound plus the air. Now, this air coming out is about the 13 liters per minute or 18 kiloliters per day, which is much more than you would expect of the wound fluid. And it's actually requiring most of the power that the system's requiring. The therapy alone only takes 20 microwatts, but the air leak and the inefficiencies of the system is taking the 3.5 watts of power. So we know right here, just by doing a fundamental physics breakdown, that if we eliminate these inefficiencies, we could really make the most efficient devices, which is a requirement if we want the largest breadth of our device as far as access and applicability. So now let's move on to the next stage in our design process, which is creative, simple, smart design and prototype development. Now, I can't stress enough that using a formal design process is critical. And why is it critical? Because it's quite easy to say be creative and go out on your own and just design. And it's critical to be thorough. So oftentimes, and I can't tell you how many cases I've seen this in, for instance, one of the steps that's missed at the very beginning of the design process is a patent search. And so even students, they go through, they design something new, they think they have the best thing on the block, and then next thing you know, they realize that somebody had invented and they reinvented the wheel, maybe slightly better, about 50 years ago. And in the worst case scenario, you come out with a device, you put it on the market, and now you're up against a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that you can't afford to protect and go through, and that just kills your device. So this is very responsible to have a thorough process. And it's really even a decision process. So throughout your design, you should have a way to have unbiased decision-making processes from all the players in your market. So from the clinicians to the engineers across all markets should be involved in your decision process, and that should be unbiased. And also documentation. So let's say you hit a roadblock. You should be able to backtrack through your design process to find where the optimal pivot point is in order to go down a new path. And it's very easy if you have this process documented already. So how do we do this? Well, in my case, I took Alex Slocum's FRDPARRC system and design process, and I added on some key features in order to make it a global design process. And maybe you have your own design process that you could add these critical features on top of. So the FRDPARRC system, what is this really? So the FRDPARRC system is really a group of tables in each stage of the design process that in each stage you're refining your design and you're creating a new FRDPARRC table that feeds into the old ones. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at an example. Well, the FR means functional requirements. So what are the absolute functional requirements in order for the device to function? Then DP is design parameters. These are the actual designs that satisfy those functional requirements. Analysis is the analysis to make sure that those design parameters are satisfying those functional requirements. And then the references that you would use in order to perform your analysis. Your risk and your countermeasures. So risk and countermeasures are often overlooked. And risk and countermeasures are basically what risks do you foresee in your design process and what countermeasures would you pursue if that risk becomes a time barrier as far as, let's say I'm designing something and I can't make it work. Well, what is my alternative plan? And you really want that so you could go through the design process and not have to come up to a risk and a roadblock and spend a lot of time thinking of those countermeasures. And it really smooths out the process. So basically, the FRDPARRC process, the fundamental thing is that you want to identify your functional requirements, and you want to feed in design solutions to those functional requirements. So first is the strategy stage of our design process. In the strategy stage, in order to design global devices, you want to have the absolute minimal functional parameters for the device. So that is, we need our negative pressure wound therapy device to remove and store fluid. That is a minimal functional parameter that is absolutely necessary. What is not absolutely necessary is we need a complex computer interface, or we need a touch screen. That might come out through the design process, but that is not what you want to start with. And that's really why devices are often over-designed, is including unnecessary parameters. And how do we identify things beyond that? And that's really our customer needs. You really want the voice of your customer. And it's easy to say, okay, let's go and interview people in the U.S. that had negative pressure wound therapy. Those are our end customers. In medical devices, your customers are the doctors, the nurses, all the caregivers, the patients, and the payers, because you have to be able to access each one of those customers and satisfy each one of their needs. And this exists in the developing, the emerging markets, the military and disaster relief for global devices. And so how do you do that? And I suggest doing a survey process. You really want some, and as you can see these surveys, you want some sort of rating number system for comparison that overlaps with each one of these sectors. And that allows you to really hone in on what the global customer needs are. And I can't emphasize that enough. The global scope is very critical in designing these devices and not over-designing devices. So for the pump, and I want to focus on the pump and not the dressing for this example, for the pump we identified that it needs to be inexpensive, accessible, meaning that it needs to be easily manufactured so that you could reach a large population that wants to access it, but also is able to be distributed to austere environments. It's easy to store in these environments in order to assess it in a local level. It's easy to assemble. You don't want anything complex because you don't want to assume that your instructions will always follow that device. It's easy to use, and this is one thing that was across, especially coming from the austere settings, is that you can never depend on education level or training of the user. It's safe. It's your responsibility to assure a safe medical device. It's portable. And this was for the pump, especially because wounds don't necessarily limit the patient's ability to live their everyday life, and you don't want your device to be the limiting factor, which is often the case for negative pressure wound therapy in the history. You don't want to require electricity, outlet power, or wall suction. And this is actually kind of interesting because historically the solutions that have been developed over in developing markets have been reliant on wall suction. And it was emphasized in the surveys that this wall suction is often not reliable and often not as controllable as one would hope. So it was absolutely stated that relying on this factor or operating off of it was probably not the case that you would want to have. And also wall suction requires power, so you're often relying on power in the end anyway. Applying a constant therapy vacuum collects the exudate for easy disposal, and the exudate is the wound fluid. And then this is the one use or disposable system. Everybody in the surveys actually favored this option, but it was critical, especially in our surveys coming from austere settings, that if this was the case, and if you can reuse the device, making it able to be sterilized is very important, because they said if it can be reused, it will be reused. So either make it one-time use only and assure that could only be the case, or make it able to be sterilized. So I want to hone in on the electrical requirement strategy, functional requirement, just because I think designing your devices, you'll often acquire electrical hurdles in your process. So let's look at the process for that through a FRDPARRC chart. So basically, you put your functional requirement in the FRDPARRC chart, and it's really a table, and your design parameters to solve that. Now, in order to solve electricity, I feel like a lot of historical methods have been, in the U.S., it's like, okay, we don't need electricity, let's throw batteries on it. And in more austere settings, it's let's throw some sort of solar power onto the device. And really, those are two different solutions, and they're great solutions in some cases, but actually optimizing and seeing what the absolute minimal solution is, this process really allows you to do. So some design parameters to solve this problem is to use disposable batteries, make the device purely mechanical, or have it operate off of an electrical device such as a cell phone. Now, our first question should be, is the purely mechanical solution, which we determine through a peer review process, is that really possible? And so doing a fundamental first-order analysis is necessary. So is hand power enough? Well, Mark's handbook will tell you that a human power could output 200 watts in under 20 seconds. And the dressing needs to be changed every 3 days. So looking at the fundamental equation of work equals power times time, we show that the human could put in 15 microwatts of power into a device that lasts for 3 days. And a hand power pump could output that. And that's a lot more than the 20 microwatts required for therapy. So we know that it is possible, and we can move on to our next functional requirement, which, as you can see, is part of the table. You would go down functional requirement to functional requirement and do this sort of analysis to verify your most optimal design to satisfy that requirement. And then after you're all done with going through each requirement, you really want to use some sort of weighted selection chart, and this is very important because these charts or some other decision-making metric allows an unbiased decision in moving forward. And it's critical to have an unbiased decision, and it's also critical to have a multidisciplinary, well-rounded, and experienced group in order to partake in these weighted selection charts, in order to identify what parameters are actually your most critical parameters in moving forward. They're all important. They made it this far, right? But you really want to know where you can sacrifice in your design and where you really should not sacrifice at all. So the selection criteria that we chose for this process is the importance to the patient, the importance to the doctor, and the function of the device. The function of the device is rated the highest. It's weighted at a 3 because if the device doesn't function, nothing else really matters. The importance to the doctor is rated second because they're the ones ultimately prescribing the device. And the importance to the patient, as you need compliance once that patient is actually prescribed that device. So we rated it on a plus or minus neutral basis. And as you can see, you total the scores. And it really allows you to identify which factors are most critical from an unbiased perspective. And as you can see, which is really surprising, I think that whenever I started designing this global device, I thought, okay, you want it to be little power, right, and inexpensive. And actually, inexpensive and cost was rated the lowest. And that's really because it has nothing really to do directly with the functionality in the end. It's important, but it's not really going to drive your system as far as getting to the patient. It will definitely impact access in the end, but if you're going to make an inexpensive device that doesn't work or a slightly more expensive device that does work, really the more expensive device is necessary. So what you do then is you move on to the concept phase and stage of the design process. And this is a phase where your functional requirements now become your priority strategies that we've identified as our priorities in the weighted selection charts. And as you can see, it's a pump with the no electrical requirement, applies a constant pressure, collects the exudate for disposal, and is reusable or sterilizable. And as you can see, this is safe. And this is really the functional requirements that are necessary and absolutely necessary for the device to move forward. And so then you identify some design parameters, which are concepts that will satisfy those functional requirements. And you go through this process again, and you analyze, for instance, the first one, a mechanical pump that's generated, the power is generated by a mechanical spring. And you really ask the questions, is this feasible, do the analysis, and go through each one by one again. Put it into your concept selection charts and select your final device. In our case, we went through this process, and each level of the design stage, you go through your strategies, your concepts, and your product embodiments, your modules, your components, and then you add these components up into your final device. Using weighted selection charts along the way in order to have unbiased devices in the end that are really satisfying the most efficient global solution. And as you can see, you're just refining your device along the way, and is really a very a really staged out process that will keep you and your team on the same track. So this process led us for the pump to a Bellows pump design. Now the Bellows pump design is great, right? It has very few components. There's one way to assemble and to operate the pump. It's orientation independent. So a lot of times electrical devices could only operate when they're standing upright. It's portable. It weighs about less than half a pound. It's inexpensive to manufacture, and also it's sustainable. So it could be manufactured locally because one key component in our design process was we honed in on devices that could be manufactured on a global scale in the most austere settings. So if you could blow mold a water bottle, which in many countries you can now blow mold our device. And a lot of people ask me, why Bellows, right? Why not a ball pump? They exist in the medical field already. And that's because the Bellows really allows you to know exactly what pressure you're applying. At full compression, you know exactly what pressure that is. And if you want to reduce that pressure, you just don't compress the pump all the way. And depending on the length of the pump, you know for sure, because it's a linear relationship, at what pressure you're actually applying. Where ball pumps, it's almost impossible to look at them and know how far you compress them, and also they don't have a linear relationship to pressure. So as you can see, looping back around, our final pump concept by going through this process really allowed us to satisfy all of our strategies to the best that we could possibly do for the pump. And really that isn't by luck, it isn't by creativity, it's really by using a thorough design process and going step by step along the way, and including these critical factors by including a global scope and really an unbiased opinion. So I didn't want to focus on the dressing part of it, although that is the critical piece which we pointed out in the fundamental physics breakdown. The dressing was a pretty complicated design process with many complex analyses. And I just wanted to point out a few things, is that we identified the standard drapes that the other negative pressure wound therapy devices on the market rely on were not reliable for an airtight solution. So really inventing a new solution and doing some complex analyses through the FRDPARRC process led us to an airtight solution. And air leaks are either all or nothing. Originally we thought, we could minimize air leaks. The thing is you could minimize air leaks, and then another person could apply the same thing in the same way, and they could have a ton of air leaks that would make the device not function properly. So really, the FRDPARRC process allowed us to end up with an airtight dressing that lasted for the 3-day dressing period. So really, you compress the device, and then 3 days later, you change the dressing and compress it again. And you don't have to maintain the device in between. So now, after we were done with the design phase, we did the lab testing phase and the field testing phase and the prototype refinement. Now, this was actually a pretty interesting phase. So the lab testing, once I was done with testing in the lab, I tested the device on myself. So I would walk around for 3 days with this device on me, see how it worked, played soccer, tested it pretty rigorously. I could tell you it never worked in water polo. It always was floating in the pool afterwards. However, it went through some pretty rigorous process, and I assured that it would be airtight for that period. And then once I was comfortable with the patient application, we decided, and the new clinical team that I worked with, Dr. Riviello and Dr. Geeta Modi, decided to do a field test. So we really did some clinical use field tests, and during these tests, it was apparent that which we already knew and we already planned for based on our previous steps in the design process, that the dressing development was really necessary to lower the learning curve in order to have everybody and every user be able to apply an airtight seal on any area of the body, and to create this universal dressing that you truly can have a seal on any area of the body through sweat, through skin shedding, through hair growth. And so basically, we went through some clinical uses, and in November of 2009, Dr. Riviello went to Rwanda and put it on one patient, and he wanted to just gauge the interest for a trial and understand what a trial might look like. And we had great results, and it really verified that producing a device and also testing it and moving forward with our trial plan was a great idea, and there's a lot of interest from the clinical side and on the local setting as well. So we moved along from November 2009 in pursuing our trial in Rwanda and applied for some funding when in January, not too long after, in 2010, the earthquake in Haiti occurred. Now, there were over $2 million of commercial devices, negative pressure wound therapy devices, donated to Haiti. Now, as we learned from the WHO study that I mentioned before, designing devices in the pristine conditions of labs and trying to introduce those devices into the most austere settings of the world doesn't always work. And in this case, it didn't, because there wasn't electricity to operate these devices or to recharge their batteries. Especially in the medical tents that were sitting out on the pavement in most of these settings. And so we were asked to come down, our team, and we put together a clinical team of 4 clinicians and 1 engineer, myself, and we were asked to come down with 400 devices. So we had 2 weeks, and we got together 400 devices with the minimal amount of money that we had from generous donations from many companies, and we went down to Haiti. Now, before we left, we looked at those 400 devices and we said, what are we doing, right? We applied to one patient November 2009. Are we really being responsible? So we decided to take just the amount of devices that we could carry in our toolbox and use it for treating wounds, but also using whatever treatment was necessary for that particular patient. And also, what was critical is that we weren't going to apply it to infected wounds, because infection, the risk of applying this device to an infection is really not known and often debated in the clinical setting. And so we weren't there to do any sort of research effort or find out any new findings. We were really there for a humanitarian effort. So we went down to Haiti with about 50 devices and 5 people, and we had a very strict screening process in order to use my device, but we treated hundreds of patients over that treatment period. 5 patients received negative pressure wound therapy with our wound pump, and we had some great results. And the lessons learned were that this was truly applicable in the remote settings. And also, we learned that in a disaster relief setting in particular, it reduces infection risk where infection risk is high, but also it creates the ability of caregivers to treat at minimum 3 times more patients, because standard wet-to-dry gauze dressing treatments, which is basically the other alternative, need to be changed 1 to 2 times per day. And negative pressure wound therapy only needs to be changed every 3 days. So this treatment also verified that pursuing our clinical trial was really a great idea and really a great effort and worth pursuing. So we pursued some grants, and Dr. Geeta Modi got a fellowship to do the phase 1 clinical trial, and we got our protocols approved by the FDA through the IRB at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, so under FDA regulations, and then also through the Rwandan Ethics Committee and local IRBs. And this trial took place between 2011 and 2012. We had 2 trial locations, which was great in understanding the different needs. So there was a large referral hospital and a small district hospital. And so it really allowed us to understand the needs of different austere settings. And we really pursued this trial and tested it in Rwanda. And a lot of people ask, why wouldn't you just pursue a trial in the U.S.? And if you're going to establish global medical devices, designing in the most austere settings really assures that your device could be applicable in all settings, whereas the reverse of that, as again referencing the WHO study, has historically been proven not to work as well, if at all. And so, and also through this process, engaging local staff is critical in understanding any language barriers, educational barriers, and understanding exactly what's needed to move forward on a global level. And we designed our protocols from a very strategic basis in order to be able to tweak the design as necessary from an engineering level in order to overcome any barriers or any problems that we're seeing in these austere settings, which we'll get to. It was actually very beneficial in the end. And every patient and some caregivers gave feedback surveys. And that allowed us to really understand issues that weren't apparent just through observation of applying and monitoring the device, but really throughout therapy. And another critical barrier was our integrated team in the field. And our integrated team in the field really allowed myself, the engineer, and Gita, the clinician, to work hand in hand and observe the technology, and I was able to iterate on the fly. And the reason why I was able to iterate on the fly is I invented a mechanical way of making those dressings in the field so we could learn that day and then apply whatever we learned in any dressings for the future. And this really allowed us, if you look at this data, our first devices, they failed almost immediately as far as the air leak went, and by the time our midterm review came, our devices were lasting for the 3-day dressing period, just through the device iteration process and making sure that we were designing under approved protocols and not introducing any new technologies that were not previously approved for us to really use. And so that really completed our lab and field testing, and it's really where I am today. And so I just want to outline what the key global design aspects of this process has been. In verifying the need, Dr. Robert Sheridan had great intuition and great insight and is really, truly an innovator. But verifying the need of any clinician that comes to you or any need from any other area that comes to you really is critical. You don't want to be solving a problem that somebody thinks is global but really might not be global if you plan on really making a global impact in the end. The fundamental physics breakdown was critical in understanding what actually was important, which was the air leaks and which other devices on the market in the commercial devices have never really focused on that solution. They just applied electricity to overcome that. We interviewed all the customers, all of our targeted customers on a global level. We used a detailed design process in order to overcome in order to generate an unbiased design process that included every step, including patents and things like that, patent reviews. We included all the key players in our reviews and in making decisions and on a multidisciplinary level. We included patent reviews, as I said. We field tested in the harshest conditions possible in order to make global solutions and in order to identify issues that you would not otherwise identify in the lab setting or in the developed world setting in the clinics. And then we had very strategic protocols in order to deterministically iterate underneath them in order to adjust our dressings to overcome any barriers that occurred. And we integrated both our clinical and engineering team, at minimum, those two in the field setting. And now I'm pursuing WiCare, and I'm pursuing WiCare as a company, really pursuing the regulatory approval and making these devices commercialized. And I really want to point out that this is a cyclic process. So going through this process identifies new needs and new problems in new devices that otherwise can form a very solid foundation for this company to build off of. And from both a new design, product design perspective and a platform perspective. So I would like to acknowledge, in particular, my advisor, Professor Alex Slocum at MIT, and also my graduate thesis committee for my PhD, Professor Wallace, Dr. Orgil, Dr. Spector, and Professor Yanis, that were very helpful and critical in making this a success. And also Dr. Riviello and Dr. Geeta Modi were critical in applying this device, and really this would not be possible if they weren't willing to test it on patients. And their enthusiasm and work ethic is just amazing. I was so lucky to have them. Dr. Robert Sheridan, again, just great ideas and a really true innovator. And then the teams over the years from both the clinic side, the donations that we've received, and the funding that we were able to get granted to us were just critical in this process. Now I would like to thank you, and I would definitely want to attend to any of your questions, and I hope this was very helpful in understanding where you might want to take some tools with you and further the design process. Hello?
Oh, yes. Uh-oh.
This is Singh.
Yana, can we hear you?
Uh-oh. Okay, please.
Yana? Yana? Yana?
Hello?
Hello? Yes. Yana, we can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so sorry. I was speaking. I guess there was some sort of delay. My apologies. Can everybody hear me now? Just write yes in the chat window if that's the case. Fantastic. Many yeses. Thank you, everybody. All right. So, Danielle, thank you again for such a thorough presentation. We have a number of questions that have come in. The first question is regarding the negative pressure technology, and we know that you focused on wound healing with the wound pump, but I think what this person wants to know is why only wound healing? I suppose, are there other applications for medical devices for negative pressure technology?
Definitely. So pumps are used throughout the medical field, and it's interesting as far as when we go to these environments how they want to apply our devices other than wound healing, and obviously we don't because we're under a protocol, but it's negative pressure in general is very applicable to many things, such as draining of lungs, for instance, and there are many drains that are necessary. So yes, I targeted wound healing, and that's really critical for our dressing solution in the airtight environment. But the pump really is a general solution in many of medical applications.
Fantastic. So just for everybody's information, I know we have a limited time, but we'll go a little bit over time with Danielle's permission. So if your question comes in, don't worry, we'll try to get to most of the questions. So the next question is, how does each user of the pump ensure the correct pressure is reached? Is there a gauge or instructions or both?
We provide the linear curve that I put on one of the slides, and basically by measuring the length of the bellows, so fully compressed versus not fully compressed, it's deterministic on what pressure you're actually applying, and it's actually pretty consistent as far as, and pretty reliable as far as what exact pressure you have in the bellows.
Fantastic. Another question, can you please talk a little bit more about the problem finding phase? How did you get started on this project and identify the need for it?
So I was lucky as far as I was taking a course and the problems came to us. Now, over the course of my work, identifying new needs, so whenever you're in these environments, especially as an engineer, you're really with a lot of clinicians, and clinicians have a lot of problems. So really asking around what people's problems are when you're in the field and understanding what ones reoccur and also what level of a problem it is really allows you to identify needs once you enter into this field and start working in it. And believe me, in medical devices, the history really has been over-designed if you look at a lot of high-impact devices that reach the top of the pyramid. So there really is a lot of space and a lot of opportunity to redesign global solutions. So I think a lack of needs and a lack of problems is not an issue.
The next question we have is related to regulatory challenges, which is obviously a tremendous hurdle. So can you speak to the regulatory challenges that you have faced? This particular individual knows that many developers tend to understate the need and don't realize the need for different qualifications in these different countries.
Yeah, so basically for the regulatory requirements moving forward, I'm pursuing FDA approval now. And so what I found is that the design process, and believe me, regulatory approval was not on my radar when I first started this project, but the process that I used to design this product actually fulfilled a lot of regulatory requirements along the way and allowed me to have the quality that I needed to achieve in the end. And also, one of the key critical factors in this particular product is biocompatibility. So since we developed a new dressing that interfaces with the skin, biocompatibility testing is necessary, and shelf life testing. So you want to know how long your product's going to last and how long it's going to be sterile for, and you want to verify that. But all these are pretty well outlined as far as how to do these tests and what requirements and where you might go for these tests. They're all outlined pretty well on the internet. And I mean, I'm deep into the process now as far as the regulatory approval goes, but it was daunting at first, but once you get in it, it's a pretty well, it's a deep and a long, but a pretty well documented process.
Certainly, and I think related to that, when we're talking about IRB and we're talking about, biocompatibility with the dressing, this question is particularly pertinent that came in regarding at what point the team decided that you would start experimenting on patients, as this seems to be a major milestone, and are there any regulations, permits, patents that need to be taken care of before using the medical device on patients?
So patents aren't required, but we did file patents along the way, and mostly because I had the WiCare vision in mind. And also, as far as moving forward, as far as when we decided, basically whenever our lab testing and the testing on in vivo or in vitro, was so thorough that we felt comfortable that the device was absolutely safe. And going through the IRBs and really the regulatory approval process, that really helps you to vet whether or not you are ready. And we were asked for more data in order to show that, it was safe and it really was functioning the way that we had anticipated. And I thought that was great. We got great questions and great feedback on the Rwandan side and on the U.S. side that really allowed us to be more comfortable in the end and help us through our design process.
To that effect, in terms of patients, did you ever face any problems with the patients being reluctant to, quote, trust the technology?
Yes, and that's actually a good point. So patient consent is basically the first step, right, in enrolling patients. And patients did say no, and we were actually thrilled the patients said no, because that meant that we weren't coming in and patients weren't saying, oh, these students from these universities, we trust them because they're doing great research. And it really allowed us to verify that people were thinking through the process and really trying to understand what was going on and making a personal decision about that.
Fantastic. That's certainly very encouraging. We have one question that's specifically referencing another product, and the question is, what distinguishes the wound pump, this product, from those available already on the market? This person provided an example of another device, which is the barrel back closed wound drainage evacuator system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It apparently comes from Alliant Healthcare, but maybe if you could speak to what distinguishes your device based on your research, or you feel distinguishes it.
Yeah, so to have a mechanical solution to negative pressure wound therapy, you really need an airtight seal, and that's for a global solution. As far as a global solution, meaning global as far as location, but also global as far as on the body, so able to be applied to any wound. Now, it sounds like that system was a closed wound system. So closed wounds really don't have the issue of the seal onto the skin, where negative pressure wound therapy is for open wounds. So that means large open wounds to the environment, where closed wounds are really internal wounds that you would put a ball drain in order to drain that, and really don't have the air leak problem.
Got it. So another question comes in from a fellow researcher of medical devices in global markets. This person wants to know that buyers in these markets have little or no resources for buying new equipment, but many problems to solve. I'm sure you've encountered that and mentioned that. What is your plan of bringing these products to market in a market with very low ability to pay?
Yeah, so basically I designed to price points that that I've encountered and tried to make it the lowest cost available. And so even though our devices require less than $3 to manufacture, and that's over a 3-day period, and is really competitive at a cost price point with the current treatment, because those need to be changed every day, which is this standard wet to dry gauze, but it needs to be changed once or twice a day instead of every 3 days. So the price actually balances out a bit in the end. Now, of course, bringing down the cost over time is really the ultimate goal of WiCare, and that's really the fundamentals of WiCare, is that I want to make profits in the developed world, and then invest in building localized manufacturing, distribution, and infrastructure into the developing and emerging world segments. And that really allows us to not only, it's typical where you donate devices, right, if you want to supply it to these austere settings. However, then people are always reliant on you donating, where if we could actually build infrastructure and design devices that could be globally manufactured, then you're really supporting the global economy and allowing these economies to be more independent. And that's really my goal, and in order to drive down the cost, almost necessary, because distribution in particular gets very expensive when you're trying to reach far out places. So if you could bring the distribution and manufacturing more locally, you could really drive down the cost to be more affordable as far as from an access point basis.
Absolutely. Very critical indeed. We have a number of questions that we still have to address, so I hope you don't mind staying a little longer, Danielle.
No,
one question. Fantastic. One question that is related specifically to the wound pump is this a one-time use wound pump? If not, what do you use for sterilization?
Yeah, so in our devices to date, we sterilize them, chemically sterilize them with the same sterilization process that they use for other devices in these markets. Now, the ultimate goal is to make it a one-time use device, so that way sterility is not an issue or never will be an issue. Because even if your devices are able to be sterilized, assuring that they are sterilized, especially when dealing with body fluids, is not really a device that I want to put on the market. And so that's really the goal. Now, you could say that that actually would increase the cost in order to have a product every single time that you're changing these. And the thing is that the sterilization process actually increases the cost of the materials and actually the robust structure of your device. And so it actually it can balance out in the end. But however, also you have to consider disposing of these devices. Now, current devices on the market and companies are going towards a disposable electrical device that's operated off of batteries, which to me, you're disposing of batteries, you're disposing of electrical components. It's like throwing a calculator away every 3 days. And to me, that's not something that you want to be putting in people's landfills at all. We're using recyclable plastic in your devices and creating one-time use devices with that design mindset and looking towards the disposable process of it is really my goal as far as the wound pump.
Duly noted. In terms of, we have another question that's very specifically tied to early stage preliminary field testing. So this person wants to know if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on the requirements for early stage preliminary field testing in terms of IRB and FDA approval. Mm-hmm. That might be a little bit granular, but perhaps you could share a few points.
Yeah, so basically if your device, you have to see if you're in the U.S. Now this is very U.S. specific, but the responsibility is pretty much the same. So in the U.S., if you are a Class 2 device, which this is, you could be of two categories, high risk or low risk, which is basically A or B. And so if you are a low-risk device, you have to have IRB approval of the institute that you're going to be testing in. And if you are a high-risk device, you need to have IDE, which is, or pre-IDE, which is investigational device exemption. You need that clearance from the FDA. So you actually have to submit to the FDA, and it's about a 1-month process for them to clear your usage of that protocol in that device. And then you also need IRB no matter what, which is internal review board of a clinical setting that you will be testing in. So, and then in Rwanda, it required the IRB of the settings that we were testing in, which at each hospital, and also it required Rwandan Ethics Committee exemption, which was basically the over umbrella of their review process. So it was more of a country setting instead of a local clinical setting.
Got it. In terms of some of the research that you also did in advance, there's another question related to existing patents and whether you had encountered any problems regarding those patents. This person believes that there's a patent out there describing dressings and the tubing used. How did you manage these challenges of existing patents?
Yeah, so that's a good question because negative pressure wound therapy, the history of it in the U.S. is filled with patent litigation. And I would say it's almost impossible, right, to understand and know every single patent out there. But doing the most thorough patent process that you can is really critical in knowing your freedom to operate. So one thing that I've been working on this for quite a while and had many publications. In 2006 was my earliest publication. And so therefore I predated a lot of patents. And therefore my freedom to operate on the technology I had back then is I'm able to use that. And so knowing the space that I could operate in has been critical, and keeping up with that space over the years has been critical. So really, as far as like the tubing and the dressing, there are tons of patents out there, tons. Really, back whenever I started this project, there was probably 10, and now I can't even count how many there are. However, knowing where I came from and where I'm going, and understanding the space that I have to work in has been critical. So avoiding the patents is necessary if you want to create this global company where you're generating revenues in order to invest into other economies.
Fantastic. So we are coming to time, and I do apologize if we didn't tackle some questions. The slide you have in front of you has information about Danielle's work and WiCare's projects and programs. I know someone asked a question about the next medical challenges or solutions that you are looking at, Danielle, and hopefully the WiCare website provides some of that information, as well as your social media. For those of you who are looking to get professional development hours for this, the code is listed on the slide that is in front of you right now. I'd like to thank you all for attending. This has been a fantastic, fantastic webinar. I've learned a lot, and I thank you, Danielle, for taking the time to be with us today. If you have more questions that weren't tackled today, feel free to email us at webinars@engineeringforchange.org. And also, we encourage you to become an E4C member. Membership is free, and you will receive more info on upcoming webinars in your inbox, so it's nice and convenient. I'd like to thank you, everybody, and wish you all a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, and hope to catch you on our next webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.